New Zealand. And she's agreed to share some pictures and some of her stories. And we're going to do that sometime in June after graduation and things get settled down for her. But I think what we're going to do it. So I'm publicly making this known. It's going to cost me, but okay. We'll do it at lunch. We'll provide for lunch for those who stay. If you want to hang around Sunday, just pay attention in June. My wife and I will provide. I didn't discuss this with her before it just came to me while I was sitting there, and she left, so I couldn't talk to her. But anyway, some Sunday afternoon in June we'll provide. And if you want to stay and see the pictures of New Zealand, I honestly believe that's where God began creation, is in New Zealand. Some of the pictures that I've seen have been breathtaking, and Kaylee will share some of her stories of what she did while she was there as well. So be looking for that. If you're interested in that, like to participate in that, we'll let you know the date, and you're welcome to stay. We limit that to 2 people, so other than my family. So it's 2 of you decide, fight it out, and come. So all of you can come. There's a story in Greek mythology about a young man named Narcissus. He was a beautiful young man, kind of like me, so if you want to get a picture of him. He was a beautiful young man, and he knew it. One day, Narcissus saw his reflection in a stream, and he instantly fell in love with the reflected image of himself. When he saw what he saw staring back at him from the water was so beautiful that he couldn't pull himself away. One day he said to himself, "You are handsome, Narcissus. There's nobody so handsome in the whole world." He stooped down to kiss his reflection, fell into the water, and he drowned. Yeah. Well, today we look at a man, and Daniel 4 is about a man who was so full of himself. He thought he was the greatest person in the world. And it was written, this Daniel 4 was written by a king that had a reputation as an evil pagan monarch. Daniel 4. His name was King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king of Babylon. This was the most powerful city in the world, which is now what we call Iraq. So you can get a picture. He was an evil king, but he wrote this chapter in Daniel 4. And some of you remember Saddam Hussein. Any of you remember him? Okay, some of you remember that from history. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar was Saddam Hussein's hero, believe it or not. And he gave himself the title of the successor of Nebuchadnezzar. And those two had plenty in common. Jeremiah 39 tells of Nebuchadnezzar murdering the sons of one king of Judah before the king's eyes. And once he killed the sons, he immediately gouged out the eyes of the king. So his last memory would be of the murder of his sons. Other rulers in Judah were literally roasted to death over a fire. His power and cruelty had no equal. Imagine Saddam Hussein and what he did and multiply it by 10. So it's fairly surprising that he would write a chapter in the Bible, don't you think? An evil dictator. But what he writes is just as shocking. And this is what it starts out in Daniel chapter 4. And verse 1 begins this way. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, this is King Nebuchadnezzar speaking, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. And when you look at that, King Nebuchadnezzar just wrote a worship song. This is the most evil man in the world writing a worship song. But this is the last person, and in being evil, this is the last person you would expect to be singing the praises of God, to be like turning on your radio and hear Howard Stern telling of the greatness of God. Anybody ever heard Howard Stern talk about that? No, I wouldn't admit to that if I were you. I did watch him once, and that was enough. Or like Bill Maher, speaking of the one true God. You ever watch him? So how did this happen? Well, there's a literary device that's become fairly popular these days known as reverse chronologically. You've seen it in movies. You've seen movies. If you've seen movies or read novels, you've probably seen reverse chronology. Can you pronounce chronology? Yeah, thank you. This is when the story begins by revealing some extraordinary or shocking ending and then goes back and shows you how it led to such a conclusion. And when you see the beginning of the scene, it seems so outrageous, so unbelievable that you ask yourself, how could this have happened? But as the story unfolds, it all starts to make sense. And in the 4th chapter of Daniel, it begins using reverse chronology. And we see this incredible change that has taken place in Nebuchadnezzar's life. He goes from being the ultimate self-worshiper to worshiping the one true God. Look at verse 4. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my place, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. And I was lying in bed. The images and visions that passed through my mind, terrified me. Notice, now take a look at, notice how things are going for him. He's content, he's prosperous, everything's going great. He's killed a lot of people, he's feeling pretty good, he's a ruler, he's powerful, he's feeling pretty good about himself. Man, he's staring, and he's staring like Narcissus, he's looking at himself and saying, man, I'm great. I'm the greatest thing that's ever happened to Babylon. Man, in a few minutes we'll see, just how prosperous. But he is at the pinnacle of his success as a ruler. He's living the good life, but he has a nightmare where he dreams of an enormous tree. It's visible to the ends of the earth, and the tree is abundant with fruit. But in verse 13 in Daniel 4, Daniel says, in the visions I saw while lying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off the leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but let the stumps and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground and the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. Well, a dream like that would get your attention, wouldn't it? So this dream does get his attention, and he sends for his wise men, his magicians, to interpret it for him, but they didn't have a clue what it meant, so he calls in Daniel, who by now is the chief of all the wise men. And when Daniel hears the dream, the king can see that he is disturbed, but Daniel gives Nebuchadnezzar the truth. And in verse 20, he says to the king, you are the tree. See, Babylon was the largest city in the world at the time, and there was no more powerful king than King Nebuchadnezzar. But remember, in the dream, the king gets cut down. So then we go to verse 25, and Daniel tells the king in verse 25, you'll be driven away from people and will live with wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of men and give them to anyone he wishes. And in the dream, everything comes crashing down. God is going to give this king who thinks he's God a reality check. Don't we need that every once in a while? There's some times in life things are going well and things are prosperous, and boy, all of a sudden something comes around and just crushes us emotionally. So what do we begin to do when things around us begin to crumble around us? We begin to do some self-reflection. We begin to examine our hearts. We begin to examine our motives. We begin to think. Some people think about God. Okay, God, why am I going through this? What's going on in my life? Lord, what? We have a reality, and we need those reality checks. Because sometimes we are like Narcissus. We get so stuck on ourselves and so stuck on me that we can't see anybody else or anything else. Yes, doesn't matter what age you are. We tend to focus on he thinks he's God. He thinks he's God. Well, God is going to give him a reality check. He's going to make it clear that he is the only one true God. So we're going to pause here just for a moment and do a little self-diagnosis. And the only way self-diagnosis works is if you're honest about yourself. Now, you can lie about yourself. Now, you learned last week, you can lie all you want. God knows your heart, and God knows what you're thinking. God knows that. So you might as well be honest and write it down and see it down on paper. What I've done when I've struggled with issues, I've wrote it down, every word that's come to my mind, and then I read it and look at it and said, oh my, that was really in me? So self-diagnosis only works if you're honest about yourself. But at the same time, self-diagnosis works if you're not too hard on yourself. Get what I'm saying? Because sometimes we're like, oh gosh, I'm the most terrible person on the planet. That's narcissism in another way. It's called self-loathing. Okay? So what we're going to do just a little, take some time to do a diagnosis here. And there's some questions we can ask ourselves as we look at King Nebuchadnezzar's life that determine if we're sitting on the throne of our own hearts. Wouldn't you like to know if you're sitting on the throne of your own heart? I would. Okay, question number 1. What motivates you? Okay? And earlier in chapter 3, we read about him building a huge statue and insisting and everyone bow down and worship or put him to death. Some of you know the story of Shadrach, and Benny, or for those of you who know him formally as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what they did? They didn't bow down. Nebuchadnezzar built this huge statue, and it was a statue of himself. That's how much he loved himself. To create a 90-foot statue of himself and say, hey, worship me. If you don't, you get burned. So that's back in Daniel chapter 3. And he was consumed, and King Nebuchadnezzar was consumed with everyone acknowledging his power. And he loved to impress others. And Nebuchadnezzar was responsible for one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They were massive gardens he built for one of his wives who came from Media. And there were these mountains and vegetation. So Nebuchadnezzar constructed an artificial mountain and planted gardens that hung down from the sides of the structure. It looked like these gardens were growing in air. And this system had been devised to hoist water 300 feet from the Euphrates to water these gardens. I would say, what motivated him is that he wanted to impress others. Spent a lot of money doing it. So what motivates you? Well, question number 2. What is your standard for success? For Nebuchadnezzar, it was personal gain. The king's main palace was 350 yards long, just a little longer than a football field. And today we might be amazed at a home between 10 and 12,000 square feet, but his palace was estimated to be about 630,000 square feet. That's a little bit bigger than this church. Don't you think? That's probably a little bit bigger than our land. That was his standard of success. What's your standard? What's your source of power? Where do you go for help? When you need strength, where do you find it? And for King Nebuchadnezzar, it was self-empowerment. He was all about himself. In verse 28, he looks at all his success and concludes that it was accomplished by his mighty power. I'm a self-made man. You know what? There's no such thing as a self-made man. It doesn't exist. You might be able to be a self-made rich man. You might have been able to make money. But there's no such thing as a self-made man. Nobody can make themselves. You're not God, so you can't make yourself. For King Nebuchadnezzar, boy, that self-empowerment. Look at me. Look how successful I am. Look how well I'm doing. God is just blessing my socks off, and it's all about me. Look at me. Look at me. Look what God has done for me. Question number 4. What's the purpose of your life? Well, for King Nebuchadnezzar, it was personal happiness. Everything he did was motivated by a desire to be happy and satisfied. You know, we've talked a lot about a lot of gods over the past 6 or 7 weeks. You know, gods of success, you know, money, power, and all that. Gods of love, and we talked about last week, and all these gods that, you know, that we worship, and we might not have trouble with those, but I know this particular God, the gods of me, I know everyone struggles with this. And if you're not struggling with that, you're lying. It's called pride. Because if you're a follower of Christ, this is something that every follower of Christ deals with. Because all the scripture says, die to self and deny yourself and take up your cross. And all these things are focused on, a lot of scripture is focused on you, what you need to do, what we need to do, you know, to be followers of Christ. And Jesus knew this was the hardest God to die. You know, we looked at the rich young ruler, and he said he walked away what? Sad. Because what? He couldn't give up his stuff. You know, we looked at Leah last week, and she was in misery, and she was feeling bad about herself until she finally had this change in her life. And she says, at this point now, you know, this time, I'm going to praise the Lord. Now, I'm going to praise the Lord. She had 4 kids, and Jacob knew her dad would love her. And finally, she said, this time. And folks, that's a mental shift. That's an emotional shift. That's a whole shift in thinking, a whole shift in doing life. And she said, this time, I'm going to praise the Lord. She made a willful decision. She knew no longer, finally, she knew that Jacob couldn't meet the deepest longing in her heart. And she knew that her father, he just, you know, couldn't love her the way she wanted to be loved. And so she had all these sons, and she said, well, maybe, you know, Jacob will love me this time, and maybe he'll love me, maybe we'll be a real family now. You know, she talked about finally, after each time, finally, maybe he'll love me, and finally never came for her, and finally came for her when she took the focus off of herself and said, this time I will praise the Lord. And Butch shared a story, but he shared a story in Sunday school, and he shared it with me. And you asked him about his story. I'm not going to detail, but, you know, he came to that point in his life. Butch, raise your hand so everybody knows who to ask. Okay? Butch and I ride on the van a lot, and we talk a lot, and I know his story pretty well. But what they would call, you know, forgive me, Butch, but what they call kids who grow up without a dad is bastards. His mom and dad didn't love him. They gave him up, put him in an orphan. And I asked Butch in Sunday school, I said, what was the turning point for you? And he said, when he went home and he found out there was nothing for him there. And that at age 14, he decided he had to depend on God. Am I right, Butch? You know, and that's why he's sitting here today. And there's some people who came and pulled up alongside of him. You know, this time, he finally realized, boy, my mom and dad aren't going to love me. I only have God. Am I right, Butch? Okay. And that's all he had. You know, and sometimes we get so, and I think that's the point we have to come to. It's the same point that Butch got to at 14. We all need to come to that point. That we can run to these other things, but it's going to be empty. We can run to our spouses, we can run to our kids, and we can run to every relationship. We can run there, and it'll always be empty. Until finally, we came to the revelation that, you know, in Butch's story that he came through, that the only person he could depend upon was God himself. And I think every human being, no matter how bad or how good you have had it, no matter how good or how bad your parents were, or how good or how bad your life has been, it doesn't make a difference how good or bad it has been. Are you going to depend on him? Or are you going to say, whoa, I've got enough power, I'm going to push through this thing? Willpower only lasts for so long. And do you know willpower is just a worship of yourself? Did you know that? That's worship of yourself to an extreme, because no one can help you, no one can tell you what to do, and you are so self-centered. Anybody ever come with any kind of criticism towards you? What do? Oh, yeah, our hair raised back on our neck. How dare they say that about me? You know? But when we get to that point, when, boy, we need to, not have to, we need to depend upon God. That's when we realize this God of me, these gods of me, need to die. Because if they don't die, they are going to haunt you. They will haunt you. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar, what was King Nebuchadnezzar's purpose of life? Like I said, was personal happiness. And how Nebuchadnezzar answered those questions are the same answers we give when we are worshiping the God of me. But see, God is about ready to knock Nebuchadnezzar off the throne of his heart. And Daniel tells the king that he's about to be cut down, and Nebuchadnezzar will soon be living like an animal and eating like grass. I think I would change my life if I come into your house and tell you, hey, you know what? If you don't get your life right, you're going to be out eating grass, and you're going to grow hair all over your body. Your nose hairs will grow longer. You'll never have anything to clip them with, and your eyebrows will be a unibrow, and you'll turn into an animal. If I came into your house and told you that, what would you do? You probably wouldn't invite me back, would you? But Daniel tells him, hey, this is going to happen. This is what your dream meant. So King Nebuchadnezzar has a chance to repent right even now. Can you imagine if he would have repented right then? But he decides not to. Verse 28 says, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, and 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of a palace of Babylon, he said, is this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? He didn't hear a word Daniel said. He looks out all over his life. Oh, wow. I did this. I built this. Worship me. Well, it's been 12 months since he'd had the dream, and 12 months where if he could have humbled himself, maybe it wouldn't have led to this, verse 33. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people on a grass-like cow. His body was drenched with dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Whoo! You've probably seen that in movies before. Can you try to imagine the transformation that took place? He no longer could live with people. He lived outside in the fields with grazing animals. At night, he slept in an open field. His hair became matted and coarse, and it looked like eagle's feathers. His fingernails and toenails were never cut, and they became like claws. And for a number of years, Nebuchadnezzar lived like a wolf man. But look at verse 34. He says, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, At the end of that time, verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does what he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of earth. This man who thought he was God is made a beast, and eventually realizes he's just a man. So how evil you think you are? You're just a man and you're just a woman. You are not God. But all this took place, and he realizes, ding, 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 woo. Eventually, he realizes he's just a man. Reality check. And if you skip down to verse 37, we see what Nebuchadnezzar has learned. He says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of Kings, because everything he does is right. All his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. This is the same guy that Saddam Hussein patterned his life after, except Saddam missed the last part. Everything that we struggle with, no matter where you're at, how evil you think you are, or how bad you think you are. And King Nebuchadnezzar was pretty bad. How many of you have gone and slain, gone out and found some people and killed them? Well, don't tell me if you did, because I have to report you. How many of you have gone and gouged somebody's eyes out after murdering their kids? This was the kind of man Nebuchadnezzar was. And Daniel warned him, and he didn't heed the warning, and he goes out and lives like an animal, a wolf. Hair matted down, long thing, everything. And in the moment, he comes to a moment when he finally realizes that he's just a man. And folks, we need to ask those same questions. What really motivates you? What causes you to get up in the morning? What is your standard of success? Is it money, power, or position? What is your source of power? Where do you go for help? What's the purpose of your life? Who wants to answer that question? Nebuchadnezzar takes himself off the throne of his heart. He knows there is only one God, and it's not him. And now he answers these questions totally differently. Now, when God replaces you, when God replaces you on the throne of your heart, you answer the questions differently. And so does Nebuchadnezzar. When God replaces the throne of your heart, what motivates you? Instead of impressing others, the answer becomes pleasing God. Is that what motivates you? Pleasing God in your workplace, in your relationships, when you're alone, when your integrity is called into question? Is it about, what motivates you? Is it about impressing others, or is it about pleasing God? What's your standard of success? Instead of personal gain, the answer becomes faithfulness to God. Man, we got to make the dollar. We got to make ends meet. Yeah, that's part of it. But are you faithful to God? In everything. Not just the departments that are easy for you, but in the harder parts. Are you faithful to him? In issues of morality and in issues of ethics. Boy, are you faithful to him in those things? Do you love your neighbor as yourself? Do you love your enemy as yourself? Do you? What's your source of power? Instead of self-empowerment, your answer becomes dependence on God. What's the purpose of your life? Instead of answering personal happiness, your answer becomes God's glory. It's not about whether I'm happy or not. It's whether God gets the glory or not. And that's what motivates us to do what we do. And and when we complain and rant and rave and all and complain, Paul says, hey, if you complain, that's sin. Because you know what complaining is about? Complaining is all about you. Am I right? It's about you and you didn't get your way. So what do? We complain about it. Am I right, church? Okay, nod your head. Help me out. Now, maybe I'm the only one. And I could be. But we make so much about this life about ourselves. And it's not about ourselves. And if you were a follower of Christ and you've committed to following him and you've made that commitment, you prayed that prayer and say, Jesus, come into my life. I am yours. If you have prayed that prayer, then boy, we really don't have a choice but to please God and to honor him and to do these things. Because if we call ourselves followers of Christ, those that don't call them, pursue yourself all you want. Let me give you a warning. It leads to destruction. You're going to destroy yourself. This is the warning. That's the same warning Daniel gave Nebuchadnezzar. How do I know that? I've seen it time and time and time again. When we pursue, these gods, the worship of me and success, when they consume you and they dictate your life, they will destroy. Not only will they dictate your life, they will destroy your life. Well, not me, Pastor. I've got the power, willpower. Nothing's going to destroy me. I warned you. You see, there's this, thinking about yourself here. And, in this continuum right here, boy, what really motivates you? Be honest. Impressing others, pleasing God? Or is it somewhere in between you're not really sure? Self-reflection, being honest about yourself, but not self-loathing, because that's narcissism in the negative form. What's your standard of success? Is it personal gain or faithful to the God? Do you want to be rich or do you want to be faithful? It's basically what he's asking. What's your source of power? Yourself? Or are you dependent on God? What's your purpose of life? Is it personal happiness? Is all, it's in our Constitution. So it's got to be of God, right? Because godly men wrote it. We have the right to what? Pursue happiness. And we have that right. Or what we do. Or are you here to give to glorify God with your life? I'm not saying you can't make money. Don't lump that into there. Some people are just good at making money. And their jobs pay them well. You can't be at fault about that. But still, what is your purpose in life? Even while you're at work. Is it to honor God, to give God the glory? Or is it for your own personal happiness? I'll work all the hours I can to make all the money I can so I can be personally happy, my kids can be happy, my wife can be happy, everybody can be happy. And when you do that, guess what? Nobody's happy. Am I right, church? Come on now. We think the almighty dollar is going to make us happy. And we pursue it with gusto. Or do what we do at our workplace. Are we there to glorify God? And I think the big problem with, and we like to do this, the big problem with making yourself God is that you can't save yourself. Did you catch what King Nebuchadnezzar, Did you catch the turning point in King Nebuchadnezzar's life in verse 34? When he finally changed, he said, I raise my eyes toward heaven. I raise my eyes toward heaven. He didn't go looking to a reflection or mirror, or he didn't go to a pool that reflected himself. He raised his eyes toward heaven. So all he could see was who? God. And that's when his life began to change. Oh, let me repeat that. That's when his life changed. You know, we learned, like from Leah last week, that, boy, now is the time to choose. Now is the time to make a willful decision. Now is that time. You might not have little Buddha sitting in your house, or you might, I don't know. You might not have a 9-foot or 90-foot statue in your yard. Does anybody have one? I haven't seen it. I saw the greatest picture in the world, if you allow me to go off on a tangent here. You know, they build these huge crosses. You know, they cost like $500,000 to build. You ever seen those? There's one down by Cincinnati off of 75. If you've never seen them, they're huge. I saw this picture last week, and it was funny. The cross had fell. The wind was so strong, it pushed it down, and it crushed this adult bookstore. I was like, boy, were they surprised. Holy cow. You know, if that was God, I don't know. It sure sounds like God to me, you know. But that was the greatest picture in the world, because that's exactly what he wants to do. He wants to crush those things because he doesn't want that to be God. And we tend to think those people walking there are bad. They're worshiping sex. What do you worship? You know, what do you worship? And we got to evaluate, okay, what am I worshiping? Why can't I move on in my journey with God? Why am I rebelling against God? And no matter where you're at on your journey, what keeps you from going even further on the journey? Because a lot of us get content and we get self-satisfied with where we're at, and we never pursue Christ to his fullest. We simply said, you know what, God, I know you're done with me. There's nothing else you can do in my life. Holy cow, you know what that's called? That's called pride. That's called calling yourself God. And we can get it, we can drive by an adult bookstore, and that's a great picture, and I'm going to find it and save it. I think it's a great picture of what Christ wants to do in our life. Boy, his cross wants to come in and crush everything in our life, especially yourself. Because he says, deny all of these things. And he says, I want all of you, not just the parts that you gladly give me. I want the nasty, I want the dark, I want everything about it, because I died on the cross and I died for you, and I can set you free from what you're wallowing in right now. Church, do you believe that? Because that's what he wants to do in all of our lives. I'm sorry, I'm going a little long. Let me finish up here. But we've learned that it's not about statues anymore. Every sin we struggle with, every discouragement we're dealing with, and the lack of purpose you're living with is all because of idolatry. You're worshiping something other than God. When what God you allow to have first place in your life will be the God that dictates what you do, the relationships you have, the decisions you make, the dreams you have, what you hope or wish to become. Folks, now is the time to stop staring at yourself and raise your eyes to heaven. If you look in the mirror too long, you will find all the flaws about yourself, or some of us, will be drowned in our arrogance. Because in the end, when this life is over, and all of us do die, you will find out what our God you chose to serve. It doesn't matter what you believe. There is a God in heaven. There is a God who loves you. There is a heaven. There is a hell. It's reality. And somebody say, I've never seen it. And I would say, have you ever seen your brain? Is that a reality? How do you know? You see the effects of it, right? Now is the time to stop staring at yourself. Raise your eyes to heaven. Now is the time to choose between impressing others or pleasing God, personal gain or faithfulness to God, being self-empowered or being dependent on God, now it's time, personal happiness or giving God the glory. Now is the time. And as we take communion this morning, now is the time. Now is the time. Usually I say go home and think about it, write in your car or, pray about it. And, and I know, 95% of us don't. But boy, to take this message and to say, what gods am I worshiping that need to be destroyed? And I'm asking you, will you allow that cross to destroy it? Crush him, smash that face. Will you? Now is the time. Not tomorrow. Now is the time. Because if you're hurting and you can't move forward in life, or you're spinning in control, or you're so self-sufficient, boy, God, forgive me. I want to depend upon you. So as we take communion, you're welcome to be at these altars. You're welcome to take it back to your pew and say, God, I give up. I know I'm not God. You're the one who died. You're the one who sent his only son to die for me, to set me free. And Lord, I release myself. God, I die today so that I can live. Jacob, could you come on up? And Bob. And as you take communion, what a beautiful time. Because the disciples had to do that in the upper room. They had to decide. They had to decide. Am I going to continue to follow him? He's gone. What am I going to do? And everything around them was crushed. And they had to make a decision. Am I going to still follow him? Or am I going to run away from him? And those disciples had to come to that moment. In the upper room, Jesus washed their feet. Jesus, he broke the bread and said, here's my body. He took the cup and said, boy, drink. This is my blood, which is shed for you. And I've shed it for you. And I'm dying for you to set you free, that you no longer have to worship idols anymore. Focus on me. This is how much I love you. I died for you. Are you willing? To be free? Or do you want to live in prison the rest of your life? King Nebuchadnezzar turned his eyes toward heaven. And this is an opportunity, because Jesus is here, to turn your eyes toward heaven. And church, if you're ready, if you want to come, boy, take an element, kneel before him. Just worship him. Turn your eyes towards heaven. If you're not a believer, he's going to set you free. I have no doubt. I have no doubt. Church, you can come.